Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for coming to the last session of this excellent UK Spine Conference. My name's Lynn Cox, and I run the Lab of Aging and Cell Senescence in the Department of Biochemistry at the University of Oxford. Now, as well as being a lab scientist, I've got a very strong interest in the wider aspects of aging research, and I'm on the advisory board for the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Longevity. In this session, we're going to explore a major goal of UK Spine, which is achieving affordable healthcare for ageing societies. So please, as we have this discussion, post any questions as they occur to you in the chat, and we'll try to come back to them towards the end of the session. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by a very distinguished panel, including Andrew Scott from the London Business School, Stuart Redding from Health and Economics Project Lead in the University of Oxford, and Alexander Masters. And you'll have already heard from Heather's talk about some of the work that Alexander's been doing, but he's also founder of something called iCancer. So if I can ask you all to introduce yourselves and give an idea of your interest in aging research and improving aging health. So Andrew, if we can start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a macroeconomist. Most of my career spent focusing on macro finance, monetary and fiscal, but I've always been interested in longevity. I think it's an economic trend that is misunderstood. And is incredibly important. So I wrote a book called The 100-Year Life for a non-academic audience. I've got a ESRC grant on the economics of a longevity dividend. I'm involved with APPG, World Economic Forum, National Academy of Medicine, all trying to advance the agenda so that we don't just talk about things, we do things.
Excellent, thank you. Stuart, if you'd like to tell us what you do.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, my name is Stuart Redding. I'm an economist at the Nuffield Department of Primary Care in Oxford. I'm a health and labour economist, worked at the Department of Health as well, very briefly. We're economists who research health and social care issues, and we've got a focus on policy-related research, and we are very interested in the combination and the links between primary care and secondary care. So of course that does have significant consequences and a relationship with aging. We generally do econometric analysis, use large data sets of primary care and secondary care and GP workforce, and some of the data sets that are out there are quite rich and very useful for this kind of research. And we're currently doing a project that's been funded by the UK Spine to look at the impact on the NHS costs that could be the impact that is caused by potentially delaying the onset of multi-morbidity and old age.
Fantastic. So Alexandra, if you'd like to tell the audience what you do.
Hello, I'm not an economist. I am a writer, a biographer, a journalist, and I got involved in this sort of work by virtue of being also a patient, well, an advocate for a patient, a friend of mine who was very ill. I and a couple of other people raised £2 million for a neglected trial, a trial that hadn't got going in Uppsala in Sweden that would address my friend's illness, and we got it peer reviewed. We did everything. We negotiated with the university. We got them their money, and the trial is now going. When we'd done this, we found out the method we'd used, a rather underhand method we felt at the time, was actually one that hadn't been used, apparently not been used before, to raise money for trials. And we'd done this, we'd gone from nothing to £2 million in about 8 months. And that was while we were doing our own jobs. So I've got involved. The reason I'm here on this stage is because this idea, this possible fundraising idea, which seems to me very simple and very obvious, and I'm sure we weren't the first to dream it up, though we're the first to fuss about it, has some value outside of that one trial we financed in Uppsala, and I think can be extended certainly into, and this was UK Spine's interest, was the possibility of extending this to fund longevity research.
Thank you, and that's something I'm hoping we'll explore in a lot more detail later on in the discussion. So over the course of this conference, we've heard about the huge challenges posed by ill health and multi-morbidity in an aging population, but let's end the conference now on a brighter point. So that was a glass half empty. Now let's look at the optimistic, forward-looking approach. What are the opportunities for a longevity economy? So Andrew, as you said, you've written The 100-Year Life. How about we start with you on that?
Yeah, okay, thank you. And one of the problems of talking about longer lives is I always run out of time, so I try and keep it short, but I'll try and set the scene. So I got into this as an economist giving talks about an aging society, and you've all heard about the aging society. There's a change in the demographic structure of society. There's a fall in the birth rate, and more people are living for longer, and that changes the structure of the population so that it's older. And invariably in economics, that's seen as a problem. Older people are a difficulty. They need a pension. They get ill. They're unproductive. Now, I think we can question that, because I think that's great news that we have fewer children to mourn, more middle-aged parents who survive into old age, more grandparents to meet. But it's set up as a problem. But there's something else which I kind of call longevity, which is on average, we're living longer, and on average, we're healthier for longer. And that sounds like great news to me, because that should be good news for the economy. So two things. The change in the age structure, that's an aging society, a longevity economy, we're living for longer. Now, what does that mean? Well, for me, it means two things. One is we've got more time. And so the question is, what do we do with that time? And the aging society kind of skews you to think about end of life. But okay, this is about all of life. And with more time, we do things differently. We get married later, we have children later, we start our adult development, we spend more time doing it, we work for later, we just do things differently. We have more time to rearrange, we change the map of life, and we've got more options to do things. The second thing is, with more time, no matter what age you are, if we're living for longer on average, everyone's got more time ahead of them, which means you've got to invest more in your future self. And that's about your health, it's about skills, it's about relationships, purpose, everything. But you've got to be more forward-looking when you've got more future. And then the other thing about longevity is what I call the malleability of age, which of course Spine have been looking at in great detail from a sort of biological point of view, but also it's about how we change the map of life. We're not bound to chronological age, because we're going to do things differently. We're going to age differently. And for me, that's the key thing about a longevity economy, how our aging is changing. Aging society, the structure of the population is changing. Longevity economy, how our aging is changing. And of course, we've got to make sure we make the most of that, because in a world where today we're high-income countries, for the first time ever in humanity, a child born today is expected more than 50% chance, according to the UK government, to live into their 90s, then what's a really important health imperative is to age well. And we've never had that before, because we didn't get so many people living into their 90s. And of course, that's not just about end of life, it's about all of life. And some recent work I've done with Martin Ellison from Oxford and David Sinclair from Harvard tries to put a value on aging well, and it's enormous, it's absolutely enormous. And we can perhaps talk about those dynamics later. Let me come back to one more thing about economics, is what I call a longevity dividend. And for me, that's got three dimensions: life expectancy, healthy life expectancy, and let's call it productive life expectancy. And what we're going to do is make sure that we achieve progress on all three of those fronts. And of course, right now, life expectancy is getting ahead of healthy life expectancy. So it's incredibly important to compress morbidity and make us age better. And I think that is about aging, and it's about preventative health. But the other thing to really recognize is we've got to make sure that we're productive for longer. And I don't necessarily mean working. Productive means lots of things, like just contributing to the world around you. It could be caring, it could be charity, but we've got to be productive for longer. And right now, life expectancy is ahead of healthy life expectancy, which is ahead of productive life expectancy, because we've got to realize that there's lots of ageist working practices. We've also got to think about education right the way through our life if we're to unleash that longevity dividend. So that's what I'm about. How do we think about a longevity society and seize the opportunities, the fact that we're living for longer and we're healthier for longer? Let's maximize the malleability of age. And that is enormously valuable twofold. One is it can make a big contribution to GDP. But the other thing is, as I said earlier, the value of aging well is immense. The numbers David, Martin, and I come up with is that for the US, increasing life expectancy by year through slowing down how we age is worth $36 trillion. So these staggering sums of money, because it really is a question of all's well that ages well.
That's a pretty phenomenal number to be thinking about. I mean, it's almost mind-blowing, though, the value of aging well, or rather the value of not aging badly. So, Stuart, I mean, you come from a primary and secondary care perspective. So what are your views on this? Are we seeing a longevity economy? Are we seeing people aging better? How do you feel, and what are the opportunities that come from your background?
Well, I think Andrew's point is the key point is that it is just, there are so many opportunities to create wealth and value in society by encouraging people and helping people to live longer. And people would be willing to spend a lot of money in order to attain some of those benefits. So it's from my point of view, the work that we're currently doing is looking at some of the direct costs of treating older, iller people. That could potentially go up if we encourage people and help people to live longer in bad, poor health. So it's important that we improve the healthy life expectancy as much as just life expectancy in general. But there are lots of things that we can do as people, or we can do as governments and society to try to enhance life and to enhance sort of life experiences, direct and indirect policy measures. For example, the government currently they've got an industrial strategy. It doesn't look like it's going to achieve its aim, which was to have an extra 5 years of healthy living by 2035, but the government is trying to do some of these things. It's trying to support people to work more effectively in older age, try and build technology and systems in the economy that can take into account the structure of the population, and also with things like public health, and to try and get people to take more responsibility for their own actions and their own health. And I think, in a way, I think that's perhaps something that we maybe underestimate or haven't discussed much in this conference, is about health inequalities and making sure that everybody can benefit from this. And it might be, yes, there might be some grand, expensive technological things that we can do to help a certain subset of the population. But I think, as an economist, I think we want to make sure that we can encourage and help everybody from all the way through the social economic spectrum to benefit from this.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, the APPG launched their levelling up health agenda. Matt Hancock was waving the white paper around on the 9th of April. So there's a huge drive across society to improve, or rather to decrease the socio-economic divide and increase health in all populations, because there is a massive inequality of health. I've got a colleague in Glasgow, and he says as he walks to work, he walks across a 10-year gradient in life expectancy from where he lives to where he works, and that is purely socioeconomic. So yeah, the levelling up agenda, the improving health across the board for everybody, not just for those who can afford it, is actually a really, really important point to make. So Alexander, do you have points you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I mean, your point about the older people not being a problem. I love this aging population, partly because, of course, I'm entering it and feel it in my creaking bones that I'm a member of it. But I also like it from the point of view of the thing that I want to talk about, because what we're relying on is a donor patient, a funder, a wealthy funder, to finance trials so that those who have not been able to benefit from the trials can have trials for diseases that are rare diseases, or studies that are not being developed because of funding not coming from anywhere else. But the aging population, my original title for this funding mechanism was the Plutocratic Proposal. And as far as I'm aware, most plutocrats are quite elderly. So I'm all for the aging population, because I'm imagining a great surge in donors to supply funding for trials that might otherwise not get funding because they're in obscure niche areas, or because, and I think this is a more important point, which I've not explored a great deal, and you would know about a lot more. But it seems to me that everyone is becoming interested in how they're going to get through into old age comfortably, rather than the miserable way people seem to have so often had to put up with it in the past. And that there are these opportunities there, and that they are willing to engage. If they can find a mechanism, they're willing to put money down to make sure your research gets going and it is seen to develop quickly in time for them.
I mean, we're starting to see some of that with the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs who are no longer in their first flush of youth, and they're getting very, very interested in the biotech space in aging. So I think the plutocrats won't necessarily be old and creaky and white-haired, but they're definitely advancing in years faster than they'd like. So we may well have some funding coming from those aspects.
Sorry, Andrew, is that really new though? I mean, you had people trying to find the elixir of life for centuries. It's always been the kings and the lords and the rich parts of society that have been keen to try and save themselves and drag along everybody else with them.
But there's always been that. But can I also, I think this is one of the things that we pick up on the paper with David and Martin, that what's really interesting about how we age is that the better we age, the more old people there are, and the more they value further improvements in how we age. So actually, there's like a sort of a virtuous circle at work here. The more older people there are, not just the more plutocrats there might be to finance things, and obviously rich old people are very interested in funding aging research, but there's just more of them. And actually, unlike other diseases, age-related diseases, sort of the better we get at dealing with them, the more old people we're going to have, and the more there's going to be a demand for it. This is just the beginning, I think, of something taking off. And Lynn, your comment about inequality and Stuart's is interesting, because what I find when I talk to a lot of people about some of the subjects that you've been dealing with in this conference is a resistance to the notion that age is malleable. And then, of course, they always point out health inequality, and you go, well, you know, that's it. Proof positive that we can, age is malleable. Socioeconomic circumstances influence it, and it's that combination of the biology that's been a focus of the conference and the socioeconomic that really has to be our focus. Both of them are incredibly important.
And I think we have to bring them both together as well. You can't have one without the other. So I think it was mentioned earlier in the conference that designing clinical trials without including social scientists is not going to be a positive way of doing things. You've got to engage your target audience right from the outset to make sure that whatever you're trying to do is going to be acceptable. And of course, the field historically has had a problem of the difficulty of people talking about immortality and those more mainstream people, I might include myself amongst them, talking about improving health in later life. And I encounter quite a lot of opposition when I go and give public talks about why on earth would you want to make people live forever? Well, we're not trying to do that. We're just trying to decrease that morbid period, the time of ill health at the end of life. And it's shockingly bad in the UK. I mean, men are having 16 odd years of ill health on average at the end of life. Women, 19 years spent in poor health with multi-morbidity. Now, we know that that's malleable. It's malleable on a socioeconomic level. So in Sweden, what they've done is reduced socioeconomic inequalities, and they've compressed the morbid period quite significantly. So if you look at Eurostat data, it's really quite shocking the difference between the UK and Sweden in terms of healthy life expectancy and the gap between healthy life expectancy and total life expectancy. But what we now know is it's malleable right up to the end, as far as we can see with the studies from animal models in mice. You can take very sick, very old mice, prematurely aging mice, and naturally aged mice, and you can improve their health all the way through with biological interventions. So the malleability is a really important point, but the way we need to get the message across is that you need different interventions at different stages of the life course. So for young children, they need to grow up in an environment free of pollution. For middle-aged people, you need to encourage them to engage with nature, to take more exercise, to eat healthily. And then for the very old who are already sick, then we have the drugs and the affordable healthcare. And I think unless we accept that there are different ways of doing it for people at different stages of their life, then we're going to really hit a bit of a barrier. So in terms of that, how can we adapt current practices in healthcare systems so that we can start to develop these longer, healthier lives? So, I mean, Stuart, with your primary and secondary healthcare aspect, I think that's something that can you start the conversation on? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think the key with a lot of this is to make people try and take responsibility for their own actions and their own health. Of course, you can, as a government, try and encourage sort of public health interventions. And I think, like you were just saying, Lynn, you've got to try and encourage people to exercise more. You've got to try and encourage them to eat better, not smoke, not drink. I'm always a little bit cautious about trying to enforce people to make these decisions, but a lot of the time people aren't behaving, as an economist I shouldn't say this, they don't always behave rationally, which leads to sort of behavioral economics ideas and silly little things that can and have had significant impacts, like putting gyms in the park. They're not necessarily going to get used, but giving people the facilities and the opportunity to do things that would sort of, they might subconsciously think, oh yeah, if I can see it, I might be more inclined to use it. Other sort of similar behaviors, like taking sweets away from checkouts in supermarkets, where you're encouraging people to not make those bad impulse decisions. It's a very small issue that can actually have quite a big impact in the overall. And of course, if you really want to start getting involved, you need to make people to genuinely take full account of the social cost of their behavior. And you could start taxing fast food and sweets and things like that in the same way that we've been taxing cigarettes and alcohol for years. So you've got policy that can be used to try and improve people's behavior in a not necessarily coercive way, but to just make them aware, really, of the things that are going to have a significant impact later in their lives. You've also got direct government policy to change the healthcare systems. The NHS long-term plan is designed in a way that's supposed to try and keep people out of hospital. It's not going to immediately cut demand for hospital care, but what they are trying to do is to use modern technology, new relationships and services in a way that can give people access to better healthcare without having to go and sit in a hospital bed and be poked around a bit. You've got things like primary care networks and remote monitoring, and the modern technology is going to be able to give a lot of opportunities for people to have their health monitored and treated remotely. And I think a lot of these things, it's ultimately the conclusion really is that you've got to get people to be aware of their own health in a way that they can then address in the most appropriate manner.
Yeah, now from some work we've been doing with the APPG, the government's nudge unit are quite interested in this idea of steering people's behavior, but that I have a slight problem with this, so you can argue with me about this, but it's very easy for us to be able to say, take charge of your own behaviors. If you're holding down 3 0-hour contract jobs, you don't know when the work's coming in. We've seen on the news recently about shift workers being given less than 24-hour notice of when they're going to have to work a night shift or a day shift. They have no control over their lives. And they live in an area where maybe there's 5 takeaways on their street, but no greengrocers. It's actually very difficult in those circumstances to make the right health decisions because of the other pressures that people are under. So economically, we've got to address those sorts of problems in order to be able for people to make the right decisions. It's not always straightforward. So I agree completely with people taking responsibility, but no punitive actions in terms of, say, an obesity tax or something like that, because it will differentially affect different sectors of the population. There was one other thing I wanted to raise on that, and that's unforeseen consequences, unintended consequences. So the sugar tax is probably brilliant for children's dentition, but we're now starting to see emerging pre-diabetic syndrome in people who are drinking too many fizzy drinks with sweeteners, because the body is tricked into thinking, I've had sugar. The brain thinks, oh, I've had sugar, and then the stomach goes, hang on, no, you haven't. So then that changes eating behaviors, and people are eating more than they would have done before if they'd had sugar in their drinks. So a lot of these unintended consequences of doing something that at first sight looks really important and effective So we have to be very careful how we balance all of that. So Stuart, I've just argued with you. Do you want to come back on that, or does anyone else want to chip in?
No, I think obesity tax. Sorry, Alexander, you go first. Okay, I think great point on obesity tax. I think that there has to be something around that, but of course, in public discussion, it always ends up about fried chicken and McDonald's rather than foie gras and tiramisu. So there is a deep-seated paternalism there, which I think it is a challenge. So there's a lot to be thought of, and I think I'll talk a little bit later about how the system needs to change. But why I love longevity is it involves everything. That also means as a policy environment, it's a nightmare. And the idea that we have a Department of Health that it looks after health is going to be really limited in the longevity world, because as you said, the nature of work is going to have to be something that we look at. And as you shift from intervention to prevention, it's a very broad setup. And I think so much of our life was set up in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, a 3-stage life: education, work, retirement. That has to change, but also attitude to health, which was solving infectious diseases, intervening when people get ill, also has to change. But that's a big policy gap. And so I come from a macro world. We have things like the Monetary Policy Committee. I can't help think we shouldn't have a sort of a longevity committee that targets healthy life expectancy, looks at the levers to pull, and it has to be cross-department, I think, to make that work. So really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So cross-government thinking in order to implement all of this stuff. Alexander, you look like you were desperate to chip in there.
No, I wanted to pick up on another phrase, but and take perhaps off to one side too far. But I think this division, which a little bit, I think what you were suggesting, Andrew, this division between us and them is a thing that has got in the way of my and the people I've worked with to develop this funding idea all the time. And it is exhausting. I know it isn't the point exactly Stuart was making, but this sense that there is this sort of paternalistic stance that looks down and accepts the involvement of the other people, but basically dictates the way things that ordinary people should do, with a separation between the insiders and the outsiders. And I have found myself, having spent a life being an insider, in this circumstance being an outsider, and it's been quite a shock. I've, for example, when we developed this idea, this very simple funding idea, and we had to learn how to make it work. We did make it work. We raised our £2 million. We then had to learn how to argue for it, which we did. We learned that. We published a paper in the Ethics Journal about that. At each stage in the way, for example, there was someone would get interested in it as we are beginning to make little presents for ourselves. And someone would get interested in it. There was a university in Germany, for example, get interested in it. They'd say, well, why don't you come out and tell us all about this idea and how you think it would work? And, it'd be very useful if you did that. And we've got a big cancer institute. We're looking for new ways of funding, and it seems like just right because we specialize in rare diseases. But we're not going to pay you. We're going to take a lot of money because we're professors and we're part of the institution. But we're not even going to pay your plane fare. But you will be honored to come and see us. You'll be really delighted to come and see us. And so this sense, there are instances of that all the time, but there are instances on the other side where people have been very, very generous, both with their time and their effort and their concern for our ideas. But just to come really, it's to elaborate on Andrew's points, that this sense of, to me, one of the great developments in, or the one ways we can adapt, to take your phrase, current practice in health systems, is to involve the people who are the patients. And forget thinking about them as the alter, the in this other world who need to be things dealt to them, and they're brought in and put in hospital beds and then get out again. But actually engage them in the process of developing the healthcare. That seems to me an important thing to do.
Yeah, I think, Stuart, that comes back to your point, doesn't it, about not just taking responsibility, but being empowered to do so. So do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sitting here defending the government or their policies or anything, but there is also a push towards personal health budgets where you are more involved in deciding the sort of treatments that you get. And it might be, for example, one of the examples that they use is an older person who's got knee problems. They might not particularly want to get their knee replaced, but they might just want to be able to do their gardening. So instead of spending whatever it costs to do a knee replacement, you get gardener in and you raise their flower bed so that they can access them more appropriately. Things like that, and social, I think they're called social prescriptions, where it's not necessarily, changing the subject a little bit, but it's not necessarily just about treating the disease and treating the person as a mechanical object, but treating the holistic element of their life. And what they actually want from life might not be a working knee, it might be an environment that suits their limitations more appropriately.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's all the talk about disability adjusted life years. And I mean, obviously, we've got economists with us all about not just saying this costs so much for a drug or this costs so much for an intervention, but also taking into account the quality of life that is improved. And I think the prevention thing is really important. So the social prescribing, I was reading this morning about mental health, 20% of disability adjusted life years lost are due to mental health problems. And social prescribing, such as, I can't remember what it's called, but where you go and walk in a forest and immerse yourself, I think it's forest bathing, apparently improves mental health quite significantly. The built environment is also important. But of course, that comes onto a much broader socioeconomic front that we can't really deal with in this particular meeting. But there are things that we can deal with in terms of the healthcare system not being an illness care system, but a healthcare system, about combining things like the public health sector with the healthcare sector and making it one continuous thing, which I think the changes are going to happen soon. But we've seen how important it is at the moment that they're not joined up, they're not necessarily talking to each other. So Andrew, yeah, you've got a point on that, don't you?
No, well, I think you're absolutely right about joining that, and clearly that's important. But I think if you pull together everything we've been talking about, we're going to have to revisit what we think by the health system. And what are the two sectors of the economy that always grow as a share of GDP? It's health and education, probably finance as well, but let's focus on health and education. They're both going to grow in importance, but I think who provides them is going to shift. And I think it's also what Alexander was hinting at. There's sort of a democratization happening in health and a commercialization. How we reconcile this with not increasing inequality is going to be a big issue, but we're going to see the health system explode beyond the traditional health providers. It'll be food supplements, it'll be the gym. I mean, there's going to be a raft of things that will support this, all of which is legitimate, but always going to also create a big headache as to who provides the healthcare. When you shift from intervention to prevention, your health system and the providers increase. You're going to see people hacking health. It's going to change a lot, just as we're also seeing with education, with a raft of online learners hacking the system. So that would be the other big change, I think, for what happened.
I mean, you're talking about hacking the system, like fitness trackers, and just we heard earlier in the session about the feedback that you get from finding out about your own health and then being able to adapt and make sensible interventions yourself. But we've got a question from the audience that's come in about, again, it's economic, it's financial, but what does the economic modelling tell us about the potential financial benefits of early intervention in multi-morbidity? Presumably from that, one would hope that if you intervene early enough, you don't get multi-morbidity. So you don't get the association of diabetes with dementia and cardiovascular disease. And then as a follow-up to that, what will engage investors and pharma to work on the new types of therapeutics? So very important question. Who wants to start with that one? All right, it's a bit of an economics question. Stuart, Andrew? Go on, one of you be brave.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a bunch of ways of looking at this. One is to sort of say, how much would NHS save if we don't have to care for all these diseases? And that's important, but I have to say, I think it's not the most important. Another one is kind of how much will GDP flourish if we're healthier for longer and we can work for longer? And it's a big, big number. I'm afraid I can't give you a simple number, because just as biologists are trying to work through the implications of how we age, and it's complicated, I think economists have still got to actually think through all the implications, because it depends also upon what we do in education and how we get rid of age. And there's so much, but it'll be a huge effect. There's no reason why, just as we improve the health of young children, improve their education and unleashed a massive GDP benefit, the same should happen for people aged over 50. But in terms of your answer, I mean, in my paper with David and Martin, I keep coming back to, tries to look at this issue, and it's a staggering number. And of course, the earlier you start, the bigger. And what's crucial, if you can try and somehow slow down aging or even reverse it, is of course you're going to hit a number of diseases. So first of all, it's a huge number because if we live longer lives, health is incredibly important. We all want to compress morbidity. Secondly, if you can do something that affects aging, that affects a number of diseases, you're going to aggregate the benefits across those diseases. And then there's a synergy because, you know, if you can reduce the incidence of cancer, there's still dementia and other diseases, but if you can slow all of them down, then there's this compounding effect because you increase the value of treating each particular disease. So the numbers are enormous. The earlier you start, it's huge. And as I say, we called our title originally All's Well That Ages Well, because it is just a staggering amount of money, quadrillions, trillions of aggregate benefit. How do you get investors interested? I think, you know, we're a bit hooked up on aging. So first of all, it's incredibly risky, of course, as an investor, because we're still at early stages. Someone I once, Jim Miller, I think, describes it as we're at the dial-up stage of the internet sort of thing. So you know, there's still an awful lot of risk around here. So investors don't like risk. They've also, I think, got to sort of understand, you know, what's going to happen at the other end. But the value will come. But for me, I think one of the challenges we've got, because we refer to an aging society, is we always think about the silver economy, is what it's called. They're sort of, you know, looking after the needs of older people and how it's, you know, in Japan they sell more adult diapers than baby diapers, and that's the big market. I think that's a mistake. I'm trying to coin the phrase the evergreen economy, because the most important thing is aging well. And of course you could look after the needs of older people, but the really, really valuable thing is aging well. And that market will start to develop. I think you're probably going to, first of all, start seeing it develop around consumer supplements, because the hurdle is just lower. Now, whether that's going to be a good or a bad thing longer term for the progression of the sector, I don't know, but it will happen, but it's still just very early days. But investors will start to understand how much people are prepared to age well. And I think one of the challenges is that understanding the longevity sector is it just about the science, or is it something broader? And we kind of got to make it an investor theme, just like sustainability has become an investor theme, because right now it's just kind of, just as governments have it spread across different departments, investors don't quite realize the connection.
Yeah, I think I've come across quite a lot of VC interest in early biotech in the aging sphere, but pharma are more hesitant. And I think part of the problem has been that aging as an indication for a drug is not yet accepted by the FDA. So I think the TAME trial, I don't know if people are aware of this, treating aging with metformin that Nir Barzilai is running in America, that might open the door to accepting a mixed endpoint, so progression to any one of a number of different age-related diseases as an indicator of aging and multi-morbidity. But at the moment, pharma are hesitant because of the absence of a market that is clearly defined as being acceptable to the FDA. So, Stuart, have you come across anything about the way we can discuss multi-morbidity, aging and age-related diseases in that context?
Well, yeah, I wanted to add a slightly less positive spin on this, because ultimately the benefits and the scale of the benefits depend on exactly the assumptions that you're making in the way that you're going to be able to affect multi-morbidity. If you can delay the onset of multi-morbidity, but then just end up, like we touched on earlier in the conversation, about spending longer in ill health, then the costs to society could actually go up. It might be that you might be able to raise more money from tax and have a more access to more funds, but it's not guaranteed that there will be savings, because, like I said, if you've got more people in ill health, then you have to pay for their healthcare, you have to pay for their social care, you have to pay for their pensions. You might also, I know Andrew said about drugs that will or could potentially target all healthcare conditions. But ultimately, if you live longer, you are more inclined to suffer from dementia or joint problems. So unfortunately, something's going to get you in the end. And it might just be that you're opening yourself up to other potentially more expensive healthcare conditions. So, I mean, I totally understand, and we all assume and we all focus on cost savings, and that's the angle that we're looking at with some of the research we're doing at the moment in our team. But it's not 100% stone certain, definite savings. And I think we just need to be a little bit aware when we're having these discussions that it's not, yeah, there could be downside.
Yeah, no, I agree with you that we have to be very careful. Again, this unintended consequences. If someone has an MI and they get stented and in their 60s and then they survive till their 80s and get dementia, then you've spent a lot of money, but you're also going to cost a lot of money. But what if you stop them from having cardiovascular disease altogether? They don't end up with vascular dementia. We get rid of inflammation. They may not get Alzheimer's disease. So if there is something fundamental we can do in middle age that will stop people developing any of these diseases of later life, then I think there might be potential. I mean, the squaring the curve that we've heard about a lot in this conference. And there is some data from Hutchinson-Gilford progeria. There's now some gene therapies and some drugs in mice that definitely do square that curve. The survival curves are very, very different in animals that have been treated with these new therapies. So I think there's optimism that we might be able to compress the morbid period and save on that. Alexander, do you have any input on that?
Pick up on a point that Andrew said about investors don't like risk, and that is one of the difficulties. And I suppose when it comes to the question I'm going to answer, you're going to ask me in a minute to develop a little bit more about my. It comes down to this as well. We found difficult was investors like risk. We had a trial to fund, which investors were not prepared to fund. Ordinary investors were not prepared to fund for one of any number of reasons. But it does seem to me that what you can do to try and mitigate that, and what we thought, well, there are those investors who aim to make money out of clinical trials, and are those who make generous donations towards it in the name of humanity. And what we intended to do was a slightly different way, cut between these two, and said, well, you're not going to make money out of this if you invest in it, but we are going to offer you access to the potential benefits, also to the potential risks. And I think that's an area that needs exploration, that there's been too much focus on either you must be a profiteer in this market, or you must be a generous saint or a government. Not enough on the fact that one of the most powerful things motivates people, and I would see this over and over again, and if you're ever a patient yourself involved with patients, you recognize it instantly the moment you go into a hospital waiting, is a kind of desperation, get me well. And that, you can protect it in a sense of not end up exploiting the person who feels it, is such a powerful reason for people to invest. And that's what our mechanism tried to do, to take advantage of this, to use this force for investment that wasn't the profiteering force that failing us, and wasn't the very generous force that comes from the billionaires or the governments, but offered something something in the middle.
Okay. Yeah, Alexander, we've lost your video, unfortunately, but we can still hear you. No, that's a very good point. I mean, everybody has a personal vested interest in not being ill, or if they are ill, in improving their own health as well. So perhaps we can tap into that a little bit. So I'm wondering now, I mean, I believe that there is great economic potential and great promise in the therapies that are being developed at the moment. But obviously there's a huge upfront cost. So what interesting new ways ought we be approaching the economics of healthcare and drug discovery so that these solutions are affordable, that it's not that we develop something with the money from a billionaire from Silicon Valley, they get the treatment first and everybody else has to wait 10 years. How can we make sure that it is something that is equitable and affordable by healthcare systems, particularly national healthcare systems where the taxpayer has to foot the bill? So, Alexander, if you'd like to take up on that, elaborate your point a bit more on that. What have you been? Oh, you're back on camera as well, which is great. So, what are the innovative ways?
Can you repeat that question again? Because I was just replying to the little thing you've done on the chat to me about my video to see whether it would come back on. If you don't mind saying it again, I was distracted.
Okay, right. So you've already come up with an innovative way of dealing with the cost of clinical trials. So how can we then adapt all this stuff to make sure that healthcare becomes affordable to everybody, not the few? So new drug discovery, new models of healthcare. So tell us a little bit about exactly how you set up your trials, how it was funded, and how it actually benefited everybody rather than just the donor.
Okay, well, I mean, this will necessarily be anecdotal, as I've explained to you before. I am not a broad expert in this field, but I began with a friend who was very ill and who needed some treatment that would be something in addition to what was already available, because what was already available was not working, for a neuroendocrine cancer. And I searched around and searched around and searched around, and eventually found something at Uppsala. And University of Uppsala, very respectable institution, turned out to be a very respectable product, well, very respectable lab behind it. And I thought, well, this seems possible to fund. Let's try and fund this, or let me see if I can. So I rang up the professor, and I think this is just a mark of how things have changed in the last 10 or 15 years. This was 10 years ago, and he was a remarkable professor. But I think there are more professors now who would be willing to pick up the phone, as he picked up the phone when I rang. And I said, look, I'll fund your trial. If I don't know how I'll do it, I'll fund it if you do one thing. You promise to put my friend on it. And he said, astonishing man, he said, yes, go ahead, try it. So I did, and quickly realized this, I had bitten off a lot more than I could chew, or a lot, I couldn't even begin to know how I was going to do this. So it seemed to me what I needed to do was appeal to the patients rather than the organizations that were already set up. Because this man, this professor in Uppsala, he'd done all that. He'd done all the applications for funding. He'd got all this investors saying, no, they didn't feel there was enough in it. And I then wrote a couple of pieces in the papers and was joined by two immensely able journalists and people who know how to deal with the media. And we ran this campaign. The essence of it came, and we raised this money fairly quickly. And the essence of it that seemed to me, the thing that distinguished our campaign from other such campaigns, one is the timing of it. We were quite early on in this process. We used social media and we got people engaged. But that we quickly realized what we needed to do was not go for the familiar profit motive in an investor. We had to go for self-interest. And as soon as we realized that, of course, what happened is all around us in organizations, they said, you can't do this, you shouldn't do that, it's bad for this, that, and the other reason. But we didn't really care about that. All we wanted to do was get the money. And the method we adopted to begin with, I thought was probably illegal and most certainly unethical. I didn't care about that either. I just wanted this money for my mate. And we got the trial going. She unfortunately died on the very day we got the money in. But we managed to promote the idea and to, in particular, secure the same deal that I had managed to secure for my friend, namely, if I got the money, they would put her on the trial, assuming she was still a suitable candidate come the time. We got someone, a big, well, in plutocratic terms, probably a middle-sized plutocrat, to invest his money on the same arrangement. If he put his money in, they gave him the medicine. Well, it wasn't a medicine. He shared in the risks and the potential benefits of the trial, but he was guaranteed a place, assuming he was still suitable for the trial. So he accepted all that. And I flew out to meet him in Geneva, and I said, look, I don't know why this isn't done all over the place. And he said, why don't you do this all over the place? And he said, I want to fund 10 trials like this. And I don't care if every single one of them fails. I want at least a shot of it. And I do fully understand that it is a selfish motivation. I'm quite happy with that. But the requirement is, in each case, you have to pay for everyone else on the trial. That was the deal. That's what got round this sense of, oh, it was just a rich person coming in and grabbing all the goodies. It was a rich person coming in and grabbing a potential goodie for themselves, but shackled to the requirement that they also grab those goodies for everyone else who was necessary to make that trial function. And that's what made it, to me, seem a perfectly acceptable solution, although I could see how it might be considered unethical. Then when we came back, we'd raised the money, and my friend had died, and I was sick to death of the whole business. Didn't want anything to do with it. But about a year later, I was talking to various people, and they said, you raised that money very, very fast. And you raised it for an unpromising trial, the promising compound, but not one that was going to make anyone a lot of money, by the sounds of it, in a weird little disease. off in this country over there, not even at home. How did you do it? So we worked on this a lot. We thought about this a lot, realized what we'd done is basically take a self-interested person and put them in contact with a professor. That led to all sorts of potential ethical complications. So we had to then devise a mechanism by which this could be done, whereby a single person in the simplest instance comes in, pays a lot of money in order to fund a trial that may or may not benefit them come the time that the trial is ready to go. And the whole thing is, there's a buffer in there. There's a region of protection, protecting both the researchers from being manipulated by the donor and the donor from being pushed around and exploited by the researchers. And that's what we call a matching agency. And the whole sort of ethical bundle is caught up in there, and is you know, that has the principles of that have to be worked out. But essentially, it's a very, very simple system. There's a lot of funding already done for funders to fund research. Usually they do it for profit or out of philanthropy. We were just putting in a separate one, self-interest in health issues. This idea, it seems to me.
Yeah, that sounds a really cool idea. Sorry to.
No, go ahead. As I explained,
something that you mentioned actually that rang a few bells, because you mentioned that sometimes you can have compounds that are very efficacious but are not of interest to drug companies. So particularly when you've got drugs coming off patent, why would a drug company put millions or billions into developing that if they're not going to get any money coming back in? So I mean, Graham mentioned earlier about the bisphosphonate trial. They needed $30 million to run a trial. And despite going around Wall Street and everywhere else, they couldn't raise that money at the time. The TAME trial that is about to kick off, $40 million, huge amounts of money for drugs that are off patent. So it's actually very difficult to engage pharma on this. So that's a very interesting model. Now, I wanted to bring in Stuart on something slightly related to this, and it's actually why trials cost so much money. And maybe there's new ways of doing it that don't necessarily cost so much money. So the example of the recovery trial that Peter Horby has been running with COVID, can we change the way we do healthcare and drug discovery and drug development and trials in order to be able to make it much cheaper and easier and maybe supportable by the public purse to do trials of drugs that are off patent?
I think the particular thing that I take from that is what we've said about unintended consequences. There are it's been the theme of the talk really, but there are like you said, there are so many drugs out there that are being prescribed to so many people for specific reasons. But we have now got incredibly rich data sets about primary care, secondary care. If you know, if you have the right connections in the right places, you can get very good hospital data. You can get clinical trials are being increasingly encouraged to share their data to other researchers so that they can study it and see what else might be there. And I think, from my point of view, I think doesn't overcome the problem that you just mentioned about getting pharma companies to research them and to actually pay for the clinical trials, but it does give a shortcut to governments and healthcare providers to pursue these drugs in a way that might be worth pursuing that we wouldn't have even considered. I mean, the bisphosphonates thing that we were talking about there and that Graham and James were talking about earlier, there is so many unintended benefits from drugs like that. I suspect, and I don't know because I haven't studied them, that there are hundreds or thousands of other drugs that are equally as cheap, that are equally being prescribed to a very small subset of the population in particular circumstances that could have significant benefits to a wide variety of people, in the same way that now everybody, like my parents of a certain age who have hypertension or cardiac problems, get prescribed statins. I don't know, there may be other drugs that you could prescribe to people in a similar stage of their life who, at the beginning of their sort of morbidity profile, that would then prevent them from experiencing other conditions later on. And like I said, the data is so rich now that it's almost like we're sitting on it takes a lot of sifting and research to actually plow through it and find the stuff, but effectively it's like a gold mine. You find a nugget and it's all of a sudden it becomes worth it.
Okay, so the AI and big data seem to be the way to go on this. So data mining what we've already got rather than necessarily adding new things into it. One thing I'd like to add into this, though, if we're doing drugs for older people, at the moment, the way trials are designed are single indication. You exclude people from trials if they've got any other pre-existing condition. And of course, when we're dealing with things like multi-morbidity, people will have pre-existing conditions. And so the whole way that we think of trials and excluding older people because they're already sick, I think has to change. So Miles Witham at Newcastle and Adam Gordon at Nottingham are thinking about this. And I don't know how many people are aware of the government having recently funded a trial called Protect CH, which is for COVID prophylaxis in care homes. But this will be, I think, a new model for the way that we can include older people with multi-morbidities and frailty into clinical trials. So I'm going to keep my eyes very open on the outcomes of that trial, because I think it's quite an exciting way of thinking about treating older people who are ill with drugs that may be able to modify their outcomes in a positive way. Now we're coming close to the end of this session. Andrew, did you have anything to add on the how are we going to adapt our current practice? What are the new economics of healthcare?
I mean, loads of things to say. And first of all, what an extraordinary story by Alexander. So thank you for sharing that. That's awe-inspiring what you did. So fantastic. And I do think, you know, in terms of dealing with risk, there's loads of ways we can design things to reduce risk. And, you know, it's diversification every time. So how do we think about the diversification as needed? I think for me, one of the things that always comes out here from all of this is, you know, I'm always slightly sort of puzzled at how we worry about costs, etc. Anything we can do is going to be phenomenal. You know, it really will be incredibly valuable. So I wouldn't worry too much about how we design things. Sorry, in terms of what type of drug we want or what type of illness. The gains are going to be immense. I think for me is, again, I just come back to this new health imperative, aging well. But the aging society with this change in age structure means we have a lot more older people. And actually, we just got to start looking at that. And I think what is also very interesting is that what we're seeing is a diversity in how people age. And actually, what we're trying to do is get health to be less of a defining feature of age. And what I think we need to do is listen a little bit more to find out about the aging process in a way that's distinct from health. What is it about the passage of time that makes old people do whatever it is that they do? And what are their motivations and what are their incentives? And this is sort of, I think, a little bit wrapped in with the whole ages and stuff. But your point about doing trials in older people, Alexander's point about how we get them engaged in the treatment, I think we actually got to just find out more about the process of aging, not biological, but what is it that motivates people? And I think for me, it's more and more as I hear, you know, in writing about the 100-year life and jobs, one of the things that people get worried about is boredom. What do I, you know, or their preferences shift. They're more interested in people and community or close to them. But actually, I think that's really important for healthcare and for how we design systems, is to understand the process of aging more from a sort of personal point of view. Because then we get preferences, then we get incentives, and then we know how to treat people. And at the moment, there's not quite just ageism, but also paternalism. They're old, over 65. And that's, as we've seen, crazy. So that's the thing I'd also put out. Genuine understanding of the effect of the passage of time on people's motivations and interests and learning.
I love that idea. I mean, what a great thing to think about as we're ending up. So the holistic view of aging. I
refer to like the Schrodinger's cat problem, because, you know, I never quite know if, you know, aging is really a big issue or not, because if we're all aging diversely, if we're, you know, what is it that actually is common about age across all the people who get old? And is it something we really need to cater for, or are just old people? Now, obviously, from a medical point of view, I get they're different because of age-related diseases, but I think we need to understand the person better. And is someone who's 7, you know, we keep hearing 70 is the new 60 and all that, but actually 70 is just the new 70. And, you know, I think we've got to understand what that actually means. So thanks. Sorry to butt in back there.
No, that's absolutely fine. So we're going to have to wrap it up there. But I think, as you were saying, we've got to see people in the whole, and we have to look at people in their environment and with their interactions. So for anyone who's interested in the field, I would recommend looking at the idea of the exposome, so the accumulation of all your lifetime experiences that influence the way that you age. And Paul Paul Shields in Glasgow has a very, very interesting take on this. Now, we've run out of time, I'm afraid, but it just remains for me to thank my wonderful colleagues for a very, very interesting discussion. I've very much enjoyed being with you, hearing about all the interesting stuff that you're doing. And if we can save trillions of dollars or pounds to the economy through improving later life health, and to me, more importantly, improve the quality of life for people in later life, that will be worth it. And I think affordable healthcare through the UK Spine Project is something that I would love to see happening. So thank you very much, everybody, for your time, for putting in all your thought processes into this. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.